Hi, everyone. We might have other people join us as we go along, but I thank you for joining this digital discussion. My name is Holly Schaefer, and I'm a program manager here at Something I've always been interested in is military history, and that's why I'm interested in the Edison family military connections. It won't just be Thomas Edison. It'll be his in-laws, his children, and other people that I focus on. At the end, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And I think it's time to get started. Thomas Edison was 14 years old when the Civil War began in 1861. He lived in a town of Port Huron, Michigan, and people that were along the railroad, they were eager to get news about what was going on during the war. So he began to sell papers and buy up a bunch of papers, make a lot of money by selling them for people. And then he starts getting the news from the telegraph, and he creates his own paper and starts selling them. Eventually, he's going to acquire the skills of a telegraph operator, and he does that during the war. But a big question I had was, why didn't Thomas Edison serve in the Civil War? And you're going to say to me, well, if he was 14 in 1861, he would have been 18 in 1865, and that's when the war ended. That is very true. And he certainly had no obligation to go before then. But a lot of young men would go off to war, though they were very much underage. They would do something like put in their shoe the number 18, and then they could say that they were standing on 18. I know that sounds a little unusual, but it was pretty commonplace. So I'm not quite sure why Edison didn't go. Maybe it was because he was just obeying the law. Maybe it was because he had a hearing loss, which I think in the heat of battle would not have affected him at all. But if you're trying to take orders and train in the military, it certainly would have. There are people with hearing loss that go to war. So we're never going to completely know, but he certainly served his country. According to one of the historians that was here for over 30 years, James Nickham, told me that he was needed as a telegraph operator, and that was a desirable skill. But he doesn't turn 18 until February, and in April, at least Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had surrendered. So what about other Edison military members? And I am going to talk more about Edison and military things as we go along. The Spanish-American War is not very well known. It came about in 1898. I won't go into a big description of it, but I will tell you that Teddy Roosevelt, who will become president of the United States, strongly believed that we needed to have that military event happening because they wanted to free Cuba from Spanish rule. And a lot of young men are going to end up signing on to be soldiers during the Spanish-American War. What happens? Well, Teddy Roosevelt was from a fairly affluent background, and he has a lot of influence among other young men of such backgrounds, and they look up to him. He had been, I think, an assistant secretary of the Navy or Army, excuse me. So people were interested in joining up. They thought this was a worthy cause, and some young men joined. Let's see who they are. Well, John Miller joined the Navy as an engineer. He ends up being an ensign. Who's John Miller? That's one of Mina Edison's brothers. Mina Edison is Thomas Edison's second wife. His first wife had passed away, and he's an ensign in the Navy, and he's in a relatively more safe position. Nobody's ever safe in war than other people that I will talk about here. Theodore Miller, and I'll go on to have a separate screen about him, joins as a Rough Rider. And a Rough Rider is a group of young men that Teddy Roosevelt gets to join him, the military. There's some very wealthy young men that go off to war. Theodore would be one of them. He's only 23 years old. And then there are some more rough and tumble cowboy characters as well. Thomas Edison's son, William Leslie, joins the Army as a private in the 1st New York Regiment of Volunteer Engineers, and they are stationed in Puerto Rico. Now, this is interesting. William Leslie writes home to his father and his stepmother, Mina, that he is suffering greatly in Puerto Rico, that he's quite sick, and he was in terrible conditions, and he wanted to come home. Does that happen? Was that true? No, he doesn't get to come home. Edison sends someone to look into it, and they say things are fine. Though there's other things that the newspaper reports that kind of indicate they were in pretty rough circumstances, and that 1 out of every 3 men had come down quite ill. So I don't know if we'll ever really know the truth there. This is a story of a young man that goes off to war, and it kind of breaks my heart. His name is Theodore Miller. He was born in 1875, and he dies in 1898. He's Mina's brother, the youngest of 11 children. He graduates from Yale. In fact, I believe they have a monument to him there. The Spanish-American War comes along, and Theodore wants to enlist. He wants to join the Rough Riders. He wants to be with people that he admires, that are interested in the military as well. The regiment set sail for Cuba from Tampa that spring, and they had no training, virtually no training. Theodore catches up with them later on. They had already taken off when he joins them. And most of the time, he found it pretty tedious and uncomfortable. A lot of it was manual labor and guard duty. And he will be in Cuba. Now think about this. He is only 23 years old. He had attended Yale. He's going to law school in New York City, and he's living with his sister and brother-in-law, Mina Miller Edison and Thomas Alva Edison. He's from a fairly affluent background. He wants to go off to war. And his father, Lewis Miller, who was also an inventor of some farm equipment, supported his son's dreams because he had always wanted to participate during the Civil War, and he regretted it. So he encouraged Theodore to join as well. He joins the Rough Riders, with the most famous Rough Rider of them all being our future president, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Miller kept a diary of his time with Rough Riders, and it was mailed home to his family after the last entry on July 1st. On that day, he was shot at the charge on San Juan Hill, or Kettle Hill. It goes by both names. During that time, he dictates a letter to his mother that he'd be with her soon, but he believed he was getting better. Do you know how many young men died in the Spanish-American War? Of course, one is always too many, but there were only 385 Americans killed in that war. I'd like to share with you a letter from Theodore. He is shot in that charge with the Rough Riders, the very wealthy young men. Some of them die. Theodore sees his fellow soldiers die in this battle, and he writes about that as well. Some very affluent, wealthy young men. Then he is shot at San Juan Hill. The shot goes through one shoulder and comes out the other. And what's difficult about a presentation like this is you're relying on the memories of people who had this occur to them, the writings of the people that they're influenced by, and a lot of anecdotal history. So what happens is that he's shot through one shoulder, it comes out the other, and he's no longer able to move, to walk. He is paralyzed. In fact, some accounts that I've read of a nurse that was with him said that his spinal cord was severed and she had to tend to him like a baby. Theodore will be alive for 1 week. This is a letter I couldn't memorize, so I am going to take a couple of moments to read it to you because this is his letter from a hospital when he is in Cuba fighting for the freedom of the Cubans under Spanish rule, as well as other places people were fighting in Puerto Rico and the Philippines as well. But this is a story of one young man, Theodore Miller. A last message, Siboney, Cuba, July 7th, 1898. Mrs. Miller, in behalf of your son, I write to you. He wishes me to write to you and tell you all about his wound. He will be all right, I think. He is shot in the left shoulder and it came out the right one. We will bring him back to New York as soon as possible. His wound is a bad one, but with his nerve and strong will, he will come out all right. Enclosed in the same letter were these lines written by McClure. That's his commanding officer. They were undoubtedly dictated by Theodore Miller, who might have rallied for a few moments and desired to send his last message to his mother. Dear Mama, a rather narrow escape, but feel for sure I will pull through all right. Teddy Burke and Mr. Rementine have done all that was possible in getting extra things. Mr. Whitney has offered to write to you, but Mr. McClure had offered to do so before, and he's doing so now. You must not worry about these things, for Dr. Lesser is here now. So these are organizations, that are helping here. He is the head of the American Red Cross. He said I would come out all right soon. He said he was going to be writing to you himself. They're doing everything for me. I remain your most loving son and will be with you soon. Goodbye. I did misspeak. That was somebody from another agency that was helping there. But his commander also communicates with his family. And that note touched me so much. He's 23 years old and Theodore is not going home. He dies 7 days later on July 8th, the age of 23. The Miller family plot is on the left. That's the stones that you can see with the large stone there. And the smaller stones have the names of the Miller family. On Theodore's stone, there's a military service plaque as he served in the Spanish-American War. And you can see his stone there, and he is buried in Ohio. The Spanish-American War Memorial was built shortly before Theodore Miller comes home, and it's built in May, and it's a beautiful structure. On it, you can read this side. It said, in honor of our nation's heroes. Lots of those sayings were put in Latin as well. This one I rewrote so that I could read it to you. On the Spanish-American War Memorial, to the young men and the people that served from Akron, one of the sayings that's also written in Latin says, it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Now that would seem like a really difficult thing for the Miller family to look at because their home is only about a block away. It's up on a bluff overlooking Akron. And they can see this at all times with these patriotic sayings and the things about the Spanish-American War. What happens? We really don't know. I read many articles about it, or attempted to read many articles about it. It's kind of mysterious. It's only there for about 4 months, 5 months, and then it's gone. Why? I'm sure it must have been very painful for the Miller family. But they could look from their large home that's still standing in Akron, except it has many apartments made out of it. And they could look down upon this beautiful, ornate monument. Their son has gone off to war. He's going to be a hero, and he will come home to his family's welcoming arms. But that's not what happened. And in just a few months, very short amount of time after Theodore Miller is brought home, 2 months, this beautiful memorial to the Spanish-American War disappears. It's taken down. And I cannot find a trace of why that happened, but it was torn down. And I do believe it's that the Miller family could look from their lovely home in Akron and see that and be reminded of the pain of the loss of their son, Theodore Miller. Remember, he's Mina Miller Edison's brother. There's lots of information about the Spanish-American War. A lot of people admired Teddy Roosevelt and his charge up San Juan or Kettle Hill. So there's a lot more information for you to dig deeper on this. I wanted to speak about one young man and his experience, and that was Theodore Miller. The next war is the Great War. It goes by another name, and that's World War I. This is William Leslie Edison. He joins the Great War, or what it would later be known as World War I, because unfortunately there'll be a World War II. The US had joined the war. He enlists at the age of 39. When you're doing historic research, it's interesting because you will find conflicting information. And I did in this case. It appeared that some people believed he was drafted, but I couldn't find any evidence at the age of 39 that he was. Now remember, he had also gone in the Spanish-American War and was ill. But now he enlists, or he's drafted, but more likely enlists to go off to war. He's the Sergeant of Salvage and Repair in the U.S. Army Tank Corps, and he is stationed in Great Britain and France. And he was miserable, and he thought perhaps his father could use his influence to get him out of there. He didn't want to be there anymore. He wanted an early discharge. That didn't happen, but that will be the end of his military service. And I should have explained further. William Leslie Edison is one of Thomas and Mary Stillwell Edison's sons. Mary Stillwell Edison dies at a young age of 29. She left behind 3 children. That is from her marriage to Thomas Edison. So there's William Leslie, there's Thomas Edison Jr., and there's Marion Edison Ozer. Realize they pretty much grew up without a mother. He goes off to war, and he wants his father's support. I will say that Mr. Edison got frustrated with some of his children sometimes when they're asking for handouts or they're asking him to use his influence. So this is the youngest of 3 children from his first marriage. Who else can we talk about during that time period? This is Marion Edison Ozer. Her story is quite interesting. She met Karl Oskar Ozer, a German Army lieutenant, in 1895, and she lived in Germany. She felt like she was trapped there through much of the World War. Several things happen. Her marriage becomes very acrimonious. There's a war going on, and she is trapped in Germany. And Germany and the US are not getting along at this point. She finds out that her husband is cheating on her with somebody from a local beer house. At one time, she looks out the window and she sees all these French prisoners of war walking through. It's outside her window. They were very bedraggled. It was very scary for her and frightening. At one time, she felt like she was forced to remain home at gunpoint. As I said, her marriage became very acrimonious. Her husband actually eventually has something the equivalent of some type of emotional breakdown. He ends up hospitalized. Eventually, she does safely flee Germany, and she ends up in Switzerland for the rest of the war. What is interesting, in one of the biographies of Edison, I see something that indicates that Madeline tells her mother not to send Marion, and that is Mr. Edison's daughter from his first marriage, any supplies. There were a great shortage of supplies. She didn't have things she needed, like shoes. And Madeline says to Mina Edison, who's Marian Edison's stepmother, and Madeline would have been her half-sister, basically something, this is my version of it, that if you send anything to Marian and the Germans are at war, you would be aiding and abetting the enemy. It's not those exact words, but you get the idea. She did not think that her sister should be getting help during the war. And here's a picture of her. The picture that's most commonly used shows her as a child, but Marian lived to quite a number of years, and eventually she will come back to the US and live in Connecticut. We're still on World War I, and Edison is invited to join the Naval Consulting Board. And if you look at this picture of all the gentlemen on the steps, there's one kind of facing sideways, and that's the acting Secretary of Navy, and that's Franklin Roosevelt, a gentleman who will go on to become our president of the United States. And what even is the Naval Consulting Board? I certainly haven't heard of one in recent years. Edison is invited by the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, to head the Naval Consulting Board. This becomes a very complex event. This occurs at the same time as an aggressive marketing campaign for Edison's new storage batteries that could be used on things like submarines. A person that Edison had kind of gotten to know because he was hanging around his business and his factory, and eventually becomes his assistant and his engineer, is named Miller Hutchinson. And he's also going to become a member of the board, and he took credit for its formation. So there's a couple of theories here. Edison is invited to join the Naval Consulting Board, and that's how the Secretary of the Navy frames it. He invited Edison to join. But Edison's assistant and engineer, Miller Hutchinson, took credit for his formation of the board, because he writes a letter to Josephus Daniels and suggests that it happens. So there's this conflicting information, because then there's a letter backdated as though Daniels had written it on Memorial Day, when we knew that he was out somewhere at services for veterans on Memorial Day. So did it come from Hutchinson promoting Edison's product? Was there a conflict of interest there? Can you be on a board recommending things when you're also trying to sell things to the Navy? All those things come into play. But Miller Hutchinson also earns 20%, or a 5-figure commission on each battery sold. So there's a couple things going on here. Edison's business is selling batteries, large batteries, for different to different military branches. He is selling them to the Navy for an experimental submarine. He's also selling them to other places overseas. And those batteries had been in use for a little while, but was he the person that was responsible for inviting Edison to the Naval Consulting Board? Was he the impetus with the Secretary of the Navy? We'll never quite be sure who really started it, though I do believe probably Miller Hutchinson, the engineer and Edison's assistant, put that seed in Josephus Daniels' mind, and the Naval Consulting Board was formed. So remember, there's Franklin Roosevelt looking at the group. And there are 11 organizations and businesses and scientific people represented, 2 from each. So this is going on. Miller Hutchinson is selling these batteries that are making Mr. Edison a lot of money. He's also a member of the Naval Consulting Board. So Mr. Edison is there, Miller Hutchinson is there. So they have a business and they're part of the Naval Consulting Board. Edison is actually a chairman of the Naval Consulting Board. And why was Hutchinson on this Naval Consulting Board? Well, Mr. Edison had a severe hearing loss and he couldn't hear what was going on. So Miller Hutchinson was there to either tap a Morse code. Remember, he had been a telegraph operator, tap on his knee what was going on, or sometimes even perhaps shout in his ear. but to communicate with Edison what's going on. I have to be quite honest that Edison didn't go to all those meetings. He is a person that's going to find this bureaucracy very frustrating. And the Naval Consulting Board's role was kind of recommend things, ideas that could be developed. And I'll talk about this a little more in a few minutes. So that is going on. At the same time, Edison has these batteries that are being used. Here's an advertisement for one. The Edison storage battery on the USS E2, which was an experimental submarine. It was actually a submarine that was deemed to be safe for use, explodes in dry dock, killing 5 and injuring 9 others. A couple of things here. There are numerous figures, 4 and 7, killing 4 and injuring 7. Killing 5 and injuring 10. So I went with the one that I found most common, but it was definitely, there were definitely people injured from this explosion. And what happened, I have another historian that was an electrical engineer that tried to explain this to me, but apparently they went to this type of battery because the batteries they used previously created chlorine, which was a terrible smell and highly dangerous explosive. But this battery also could create hydrogen, and that could build up and cause an explosion. It becomes, it does happen. Hydrogen builds up, the explosion occurs. Now here's the tricky part. Was Edison and Hutchinson, who really took the lead on this, his engineer and assistant, was he at fault because of this? Well, the person I spoke to and then tried to understand, probably not, because no matter what, whoever is the commander, they're ultimately responsible. Apparently, it should have been known that these things can create hydrogen that can kind of boil up and release this and cause the explosion. And it did. It exploded, heavily damaged the batteries. So my best guess as a person that's a historian and certainly not a scientific mind was it should be known that those type of batteries could do that, but they should have also been warned by Hutchinson that that could occur. So I think there was plenty of blame to go around. I mean, there was loss of life, there is severe injuries. Hydrogen was released. What will happen is that there's an inquiry by the Navy into this. And this is where it gets really sticky because Hutchinson kind of puts the blame on other people. And it does not look good for Edison. He's saying, well, they should have known. Did you ever tell them? He's asked. Well, no. But he squarely puts the fault on the commander, on the Navy, and takes no responsibility. Even if that was technically correct, I mean, we'll never know because we weren't there. It wasn't a good thing to do. It's not going to make the Navy trust them and buy batteries from them anymore. It doesn't look good. There's a lot of people that are injured. There's a lot of lawsuits. I believe close to $500,000. I think Edison ultimately ends up paying $66 million. I think it would have been better to say, no, I didn't inform them. Just tell the facts and don't try to point fingers and blame. As I said, this is a very complicated situation. It was horrible that this happened. And they don't sell their batteries to the Navy anymore. The Navy doesn't want them. But the results of this, Josephus Daniels does not release this, kind of keeps the report from being released for a long time. So that's ultimately the conclusion. But realize this is going on while Edison's also on the Naval Consulting Board. And not only is he on the Naval Consulting Board, but he is selling things to the Navy, and he will be trying to convince them to adopt some of his other ideas. There are other parts of the military, other places that do buy Edison's products. So this gets very complicated during World War I. Edison and World War I experiments. In 1917, a few months before the US entered the war, Edison was focused on naval research. Now remember, he's on the Naval Consulting Board, and what happens is I think he eventually doesn't have the title of chairman anymore. He has the title of president for life, but he doesn't attend a lot of the meetings. He can't hear. He does go to some. He has Hutchinson with him. But he also is much more focused on his naval research. And he begins to devote all his time to naval research in an old laboratory made out of a casino in Eagle Rock in West Orange, New Jersey. He had a lot of interesting ideas. I think he had some viable ideas. Much of his research was focused on methods of locating and evading submarine torpedoes. During the summer of 1917, he spent 6 weeks on Long Island Sound on the USS Sachem, a private yacht commissioned for military service. He also conducted research at the Naval Annex in DC, and eventually he's going to end up at the Naval Station in Key West. I asked our historian that was an electrical engineer and in the Coast Guard, and he thought that some of Edison's ideas were ones that should have and could have been developed. I wasn't there, and I'm not an expert, but it seems to me there are a lot of them. Why weren't they accepted? I've never been in the military, but speaking to people who have, and how the Navy probably didn't want somebody outside of the Navy, even if it was Thomas Edison, developing these ideas. But there's so much information out there, and so much information from many different sources that are really reliable. So I'm going to go with my best discerning abilities to say that that was probably, and my judgment to say that's probably why it happened. Was Edison frustrated beyond belief? Absolutely. Edison had a contentious relationship with the Navy bureaucracy and debated with other members of the Naval Consulting Board over the location and purpose of the Naval Research Lab. And this delayed the construction of the lab until after the war in 1923. But you know what's interesting? Edison is actually sworn in, and there he is with some of the soldiers there. Now, when he's in Key West working on a ship for a while, and then eventually he and Mina will stay in a home, he wants Mina there with him. Hutchinson is out promoting batteries, and there had kind of been a separation in their relationship because Charles Edison had taken over the Edison Industries, and he was cutting back Hutchinson's role as Edison's assistant and engineer because he felt like it was benefiting Hutchinson in the pocketbook, perhaps, and not necessarily benefiting the Edison Industries. So Edison needs somebody there. His deafness, he is pretty much deaf by this point and very hard of hearing. He needed somebody that was able to communicate with him. He does not utilize American Sign Language, so he wanted Mina there to help him bridge that gap. It becomes a little awkward. At first, there's veiled politeness, but then there's kind of this open feeling that Mina is not welcome there at all. But here's something important. Edison was one of the, he provided the impetus from the Naval Research Lab. Why is this a big deal? Well, because it still exists today. What Edison wanted in 1916 was a lab on the water where a ship could be docked by a large city that would be run by civilians. Now, here's another interesting thing. I read in a very reliable source that the Congress appropriated $1 million instead of the suggestion $5 million. But in other places, in his most recent biography, it says they appropriated $2 million. And in other places, other reliable sources, and I'll list my resources at the end, say $1.5 million. But what Edison wanted was about $5 million. And is it actually cut back by Congress? Maybe not. Maybe it was agreed upon by the Naval Consulting Board. Was Edison a fan of cutting it back? Probably not. But at some point, Congress approves something between $1 million to $2 million. You think I could come up with a more precise figure, but I'm not quite sure. I know it's not what Edison desired. But what we do know is the Naval Research Lab and the Naval Consulting Board was forced to develop a scaled back version. And this is going to be run by the Navy. Well, why is that a problem? Well, Edison wants it to be run by civilians. I'm sure he wanted to be involved, but he felt like people would be too constricted by the naval rules. He wanted it to have big civilians leading it. And he was very afraid that this was going to end up under naval control in Annapolis. There are all types of places that are suggested. There are a lot of going back and forth. He wanted it in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Of course, he wanted it to be a civilian facility as well as a naval one, and he wanted it to be much bigger. That isn't going to happen. It does become formed in Washington, D.C. It is built, comes out in 1923. But that is probably the greatest accomplishment of Edison's time during World War I, is that this research and development lab run by the Navy does get developed. And it is not in Annapolis. It's not in Sandy Hook, New Jersey either, but it is in Washington, D.C. Now, what about the Naval Consulting Board? They had a whole bunch of ideas they were going through, 11,000 of them. They only seriously consider 110, and only one of them, the Ruggles Orienter, is actually accepted, and that's a precursor to something that is automated and developed by the Navy. But that is it. That's the only one that is developed. So think of all the people and time that got put into that, and only one of their ideas, which kind of leads to autopilot, is actually developed. None of Edison's things go anywhere, but he does help create the Naval Research Lab. And he does testify in front of Congress, which is really interesting, and speaks on behalf of it. And much as what happens when he enters a spring training game and the crowd stands up and applauds, and when he arrives in the third inning, well, he's testifying before Congress about the need for this research lab. And all of a sudden, one of the congressmen suggests that everyone stops and recognize him and applaud Thomas Edison as he testifies and supports this idea of one of the first US government research and development laboratories. So he was the most famous man in the country, perhaps in the world at this time, and they do recognize his contributions. And by the way, I looked up a little bit. The Naval Research and Development Lab is still there today. It is run by the Navy, but it has numerous civilians that work for it as well. Well, what about the children of Thomas and Mina Edison? They will have 3 children. Oh, and by the way, I just looked up and saw that is the ship that I mentioned that Edison was stationed on, and that's what's behind me, in case you were wondering why I have a ship behind me. Thomas and Mina's children during World War I. Charles Edison was in his mid-20s during World War I, but he was not among the 4 million American soldiers. He requested a deferment due to his hearing loss. There's no proof that that was ever granted due to his hearing loss, but he was they categorized people for their likelihood of, I guess, their area of need, and he was like in a category 3 because he's the head of Edison Industries, who's doing a lot during the war, so he was categorized along with policemen and firemen as people that wouldn't be most likely to be going off to war if they could help it. So he doesn't go off to war, and he does have a hearing loss, but from what I've read, it didn't impact him in the same way as it hit his father. So it probably wasn't granted. There's no evidence that it was, though in his biography, he definitely says that it was. But he was doing good work with Edison Industries. As the head of Edison Industries, his employees contributed more than $4 million to war-related causes. So for example, they would buy Liberty bonds. They raised money a lot for the war effort. That was a big thing that went on, people, private citizens, businesses raising money for the war. Now, Theodore Edison, and let me just back up for a minute, his name is Theodore Miller Edison. So Mina Edison named him after her beloved brother. He desperately wanted to join the army, but Mina was not about to lose a son to a war when she had lost her beloved brother. So she convinces him not to enlist, and he ends up joining his father's research staff later during his time when he's doing work with the Navy, and he is safe from harm. Their daughter, Madeline, married John Sloan. Sloan spends much of his time in Washington, D.C. as an officer with the Signal Corps. He is safe. They are mostly involved with communications during World War I. There is something written from a very reliable source that said that one time John Sloan said something about Charles and Theodore not going to war, that did not sit well with Thomas Edison. I don't know who conveyed it to him or how he heard it, but he was not happy about that. So that's my information about the Edisons and their military connections. I just want to go over some of my sources and then talk about next month. So I hope you'll bear with me for a couple more minutes. Because the Millers, Mina Miller, was from Akron, Ohio, and the family lived there for many years, there's numerous articles about them, newspaper clippings, some more modern than others. The Edisons also had a home, a camp, more likely a summer home, in Chautauqua Institute. Mina's Edison father was the co-founder of that. So there's articles there about it. There's an article about a Rough Rider from Chautauqua, because the Miller family and then the Edisons would also stay there. Their cottage in Chautauqua was there, and I found that very helpful as well. So Mina's father co-founded Chautauqua. They would spend time there in the summer. That was a Methodist Sunday school facility, and later on it would go on to become an educational facility that still exists today. The Thomas Edison papers at Rutgers University, specifically Edison in World War I, they are a great resource if you're interested on a lot of topics. Go check it out. You'll find out so much. Phil Chase. Phil Chase is a historian. He was in the Coast Guard. He's an electrical engineer, and he tried to explain to me about batteries. He's a very patient man. If you are interested in storage batteries, generators, light bulbs, Phil typically works Wednesdays through Fridays. Earlier in the day, he knows so much, and you can come in if you've got a ticket and ask him some questions. He's a great resource. And by the way, if you're interested in talking about Edison military history, or if you're interested in talking about Edison and baseball, or anything to do with spring training here, or just in general, we hope you'll visit our museum. I'll talk about that a little more in another minute. Thomas Edison in World War I, the National Park Service, the USS Flyer project. Thomas Edison 100 years ago today, the USS E2 explodes in dry dock. The National Park Service is a great resource. I did sometimes find a lot of information from them, as well as Rutgers and Edison's current biography. Sometimes there would be a little variety in the information, just a little bit, not serious differences. So I tried to present all of that information to you. And Edison by Edmund Morris, the most recent biography. Unfortunately, the author passed away. And then there's From Phonographs to U-Boats, Edison and His Insomnia Squad in Peace and War, 1911 to 1919, A Guide to Thomas Edison's Papers by Thomas E. Jeffrey. I think I have, I'm going to put a box up here. Did Edison ever have access to hearing aids? Yes, he dabbled in it a little bit, but he never used a hearing aid. He experimented with it just a little bit. That silly box is showing up on the screen. I apologize. So yes, he experiments with it, but no, I mean, very, very little. It never goes anywhere. Though I did read a couple times that he and Helen Keller talked about it, communicated about it. Obviously, Helen Keller was deaf, but they did talk about developing the hearing aid, but it never happened. They also talked about developing something for the blind, and that never happened either, but I will tell you that they did have a friendship. Anyway, what I wanted to say was that next month, on March 9th at the same time, I'm going to be talking about Edison, Ford, Harvey Firestone, and John Burroughs, a naturalist and writer. And their road trips, their camping trips, and it's called On the Road Again. We were privileged to have an author that spoke about his most recent book, The Vagabonds, a few months ago. There's a privately published book about it. It's something I'm really excited about talking about. And just know that they are the founder of the original road trips. The last thing I'm going to say before I wrap this up, and if you have any more questions, please let me know, is this. We hope that you'll come visit us, perhaps buy a membership or buy a ticket and come see us. Your support helps keep us going. We also appreciate your donations. Our address is Edison Ford Winter Estates, 2350 McGregor Boulevard, Fort Myers, 33901. I'm learning a lot as I do PowerPoints. I love doing PowerPoints. I love talking. I'm learning about Zoom technology. I appreciate your indulgence as I'm learning as I go along. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your support. And hopefully we can get more of these more often than once a month, but I promise you there'll be one at least once a month, and I will plan on seeing you next month. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next time.